Heinrich Himmler led the SS, orchestrated the machinery of genocide, and died before facing the judgment he had earned. But for his family, the end of the Third Reich marked not an ending, but a beginning, a descent into a Europe that knew their name, despised their bloodline, and would never allow them to forget. His wife Margarete and daughter Gudrun were captured, questioned, released into a country built on the ruins of the regime they had served, and forced to live under a surname that carried the weight of unimaginable crimes. Their story reveals how the legacy of the Reich outlived the regime itself, how denial became inheritance, and how some chose to carry that burden with defiance rather than remorse. Before we go deeper into how this family's fate reflects the unfinished reckoning of post-war Germany, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. May 1945. The Third Reich had collapsed. Its armies were destroyed, its cities reduced to rubble, and its leaders hunted across a devastated continent. Heinrich Himmler, once among the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, architect of the final solution and commander of the SS, was on the run. Disguised as a sergeant of the secret field police, he fled through northern Germany with a small group of aides, hoping to disappear into the chaos of defeat. On May 22, 1945, British soldiers near Bremervörde stopped the group for inspection. When his true identity was revealed, Himmler was taken into custody at Lüneburg. A day later, during a medical examination, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died within 15 minutes. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on the Lüneburg Heath, the location kept secret to prevent it from becoming a shrine. For his wife Margarete and daughter Gudrun, the collapse came swiftly. They had been living in Gmund, Bavaria, as Allied forces advanced. In late April 1945, they fled south toward Italy, hoping to reach relative safety. On May 21st, just one day before Himmler's arrest, they were stopped by American troops near Bolzano. Both were taken into custody and brought to Allied internment camps for questioning. At the time, Gudrun was only 15 years old. Known affectionately within the SS as Puppy, she had been her father's pride, frequently photographed beside him at official events, and even taken to visit the Dachau concentration camp. To Allied interrogators, however, she was simply the daughter of one of Europe's most notorious men. In the months that followed, Margarete and Gudrun were transferred between camps in Italy, France, and Germany. They were interrogated repeatedly by American and British officers who wanted to know whether Himmler had left behind hidden networks, documents, or stolen assets. Their internment coincided with the Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945. Although neither Margarete nor Gudrun was charged with a crime, both were questioned as witnesses. Interrogation reports described Margarete as loyal, reserved, and deeply bitter over her treatment. She insisted she had known nothing of her husband's political work, claiming to have lived a quiet life focused on their daughter and household affairs. Historians still argue how credible those claims were. Letters exchanged during the 1930s suggest Margarete supported many of Himmler's beliefs and enjoyed the privileges his position provided. Gudrun, meanwhile, reportedly showed open hostility toward Allied officers. She maintained her father's innocence, describing him as a great man who had done good things for Germany. When the trials ended in late 1946, the Allies concluded that neither woman posed a direct threat. Both were released in November that year and allowed to return to Germany. But the world they returned to was unrecognizable. Their home had been confiscated, their bank accounts frozen, and their future uncertain. The years after 1947 brought no peace for the surviving Himmlers. Though free from Allied internment, Margarete and Gudrun returned to a Germany that viewed them with suspicion, resentment, and sometimes outright hatred. Their property in Gmund had been seized, and they settled quietly in the Munich area, living on small pensions and support from sympathetic acquaintances who had once served under Heinrich Himmler. In the early years of occupation, Denazification tribunals were set up across Germany to classify citizens according to their involvement in the Nazi regime. Margarete's case was reopened several times. In 1948, she was first classified as Mitläufer, or follower, one of the mildest categories. But new information surfaced, including records of her participation in Nazi welfare organizations and correspondence showing her ideological loyalty to her husband. The British occupation authorities reviewed her case again in January 1953 and upgraded her classification to Belastete, Category 2, meaning profiteer or activist. The consequences were harsh by post-war German standards. She was ordered to complete 30 days of special work duty, stripped of the right to vote, and temporarily lost her pension privileges. For Margarete, the humiliation cut deeply. She wrote letters complaining about her treatment, describing herself as a victim of Allied hatred. Her insistence that she had only ever been a wife and mother clashed with evidence of her political sympathies. Historians later found her wartime diaries filled with admiration for Hitler and disdain for defeatists. Gudrun, by then in her early 20s, faced her own struggle to adjust. She had grown up idolizing her father and never renounced him. Her post-war statements revealed a young woman still fiercely loyal to the man the world now condemned. "I will never believe that he did anything wrong," she once told an interviewer. This loyalty would define her entire life. By the mid-1950s, Gudrun began working as a dressmaker and later as a secretary in Munich. She used different surnames at times to avoid attention, though those who knew her rarely forgot who she was. In 1952, she reconnected with former SS families and attended private gatherings where they shared memories of the old regime. These informal circles became quiet meeting points for those who could not let go of the past. For the women, the 1950s brought a strange kind of obscurity. The world moved on, West Germany rebuilt itself, and the new generation wanted to forget. Yet the Himmler name carried a weight that could not be erased. In public, they were just another family trying to survive. In private, they remained bound to the memory of a man whose crimes defined a century. By the early 1960s, Gudrun Himmler, now known by her married name Gudrun Berwitz, had quietly built a new life in post-war West Germany. In 1961, she married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, a journalist and member of the far-right National Democratic Party. They settled near Munich and had 2 children. Outwardly, she lived as a wife and mother in a recovering country. Yet behind closed doors, she remained fiercely attached to her father's memory and the ideals he had served. When Germany's new intelligence agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, began recruiting in the early 1960s, Berwitz briefly found work there as a secretary. Using a different surname, she was employed at the agency's headquarters in Pullach from 1961 to 1963. Decades later, the BND would confirm her employment, acknowledging that it had hired Heinrich Himmler's daughter during the Cold War. Some scholars view her role as symbolic of how deeply Nazi networks had penetrated early West German institutions. Others believe she was simply another well-connected German seeking stability in a turbulent time. After leaving the BND, Berwitz became increasingly active in veterans and revisionist circles. In the 1950s and 1960s, former members of the SS and their families began to form informal mutual aid networks. Among the most prominent was Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene und Internierte, or Silent Help for Prisoners of War and Interned Persons. Officially founded in 1951, it aimed to support Germans convicted by Allied tribunals. In practice, it became a haven for unrepentant Nazis and a fundraising vehicle for their legal defense and welfare. By the 1970s, Berwitz had become one of the group's most visible figures. She attended reunions of former SS officers, wrote letters to imprisoned war criminals, and raised money for their families. Publicly, she spoke little, but her views were no secret. She rejected any claim that her father had been responsible for atrocities, referring to him as a great man. In interviews, she accused Allied historians of distorting the past. For decades, she refused to meet journalists or appear on camera. But when rare photos emerged, gray-haired, composed, and smiling among elderly SS veterans, they became chilling symbols of post-war denial. Her activities drew quiet concern from German authorities. Yet for years, she faced no formal charges. Stille Hilfe operated in legal gray zones, presenting itself as a humanitarian charity, even as it channeled money to fugitives such as Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Leon, and Anton Maloth, a concentration camp guard. Into the 1990s and 2000s, Gudrun Berwitz remained active in far-right circles, attending private meetings and quietly supporting younger sympathizers. She never disavowed her father or expressed remorse. When she died in Munich on May 24, 2018, at the age of 88, she was still regarded by some as a symbolic daughter of the SS, a figure whose defiance reflected West Germany's long struggle to confront its past. While Gudrun Berwitz guarded her father's legacy in secrecy and defiance, other branches of the Himmler family took a very different path. Heinrich's brothers each faced their own fate. Gebhard, the eldest, was interned by Allied forces in 1945 and held until 1948. Classified as Mitläufer, a follower rather than an active Nazi, he was allowed to rebuild his life. He settled in Munich, worked in industry, and later represented a German cultural office that cooperated with Afghanistan in the 1950s. He died quietly in 1982, rarely speaking publicly about his infamous sibling. Ernst Himmler, the youngest brother, never lived to see the end of the war. A journalist and radio executive before 1945, he had joined the Nazi Party early and served with the Volkssturm during the final defense of Berlin. He was killed on May 2, 1945, just days before Germany's surrender, when Soviet troops overran the city. But not all family members remained silent. Decades later, Heinrich's great-niece, Katrin Himmler, took the opposite stance of her older relatives. Born in 1967, she grew up in post-war West Germany, knowing that her surname carried a burden. In her youth, she avoided mentioning it. Yet as an adult, she confronted it head-on. Trained as a political scientist, Katrin became a writer and researcher. In 2007, she published The Himmler Brothers, a German family history, a deeply researched study that traced the parallel lives of Heinrich, Gebhard, and Ernst Himmler. Katrin's book was notable not just for its scholarship, but for its courage. In interviews, she explained that her goal was not to cleanse the name, but to understand it, to explore how an ordinary middle-class family could produce one of the architects of Nazi Germany. Her work humanized without excusing, depicting the Himmlers as a mirror of their time, nationalistic, ambitious, and shaped by the culture that made Nazism possible. Her decision to speak publicly marked a generational shift. Where Gudrun had clung to denial, Katrin embraced responsibility. "I cannot change the past," she said, "but I can decide how to live with it." Even today, the Himmler name evokes unease. In 2014, the discovery of Heinrich Himmler's private letters and diaries reignited debate about the nature of evil and ordinariness. These documents, later published and exhibited, showed a man deeply concerned with domestic minutiae, writing tenderly to his wife and daughter between reports on deportations and executions. For many historians, these papers revealed the chilling banality behind one of history's greatest perpetrators. The Himmler family's story mirrors Germany's path after the war, from denial and silence to confronting the past. Gudrun defended her father's legacy until her death. Katrin chose to face it. Their lives show how Nazism's shadow reached far beyond 1945, how it lived on in the choices of those who came after, and how the burden of history can be carried in two entirely different ways. One chose loyalty to a lie, the other chose truth over comfort. The difference between them reveals not just a family, but a nation's struggle with its own reckoning. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.